Ezra chapter 2, a census of the returned exiles. These are the inhabitants of the province who returned from the captivity of the exiles, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away to Babylon, and who came back to Jerusalem and Judah, to their various cities. Those who returned from Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Seraiah, Realiah, Mordecai, Bilshai, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, Bana. A census of the people of Israel, descendants of Parosh, 2,162. Descendants of Shephatiah, 372. Descendants of Arah, 775. Descendants of Pahat Moab, who were descendants of Jeshua and Joab, 2,812. Descendants of Elam, 1,254. Descendants of Datu, 945. Descendants of Zakai, 760. Descendants of Bani, 642. Descendants of Bebai, 623. Descendants of Asgab, 1,222. Descendants of Adonikim, 666. Descendants of Bigvai, 2,056. Descendants of Aden, 454. Descendants of Ater, who were descendants of Hezekiah, 98. Descendants of Bezai, 323. Descendants of Jorah, 112. Descendants of Hashum, 223. Descendants of Gibeon, 95. Descendants of Bethlehem, 123. People of Nephthophah, 56. People of Anathoth, 128. People of Beth Ashmaveth, 42. People of Kiriath Jearim, Shephirah and Beeroth, 743. People of Ramah and Jeba, 621. People of Michmas, 122. People of Bethel and Ai, 223. Descendants of Nebo, 52. Descendants of Magbish, 156. Descendants of the other Elam, 1,254. Descendants of Hiram, 320. Descendants of Lod, Hadid, and Ono, 725. Descendants of Jericho, 345. Descendants of Sinai, 3,630. The priest, descendants of Jedaiah of the house of Jeshua, 973. Descendants of Emer, 1,052. Descendants of Pashur, 1,247. Descendants of Hiram, 1,017. The Levites, descendants of Jeshua and Kadmiel, of the descendants of Hodaviah, 74. The singers, descendants of Asaph, 128. The gatekeepers, descendants of Shalom, descendants of Ater, descendants of Talmon, descendants of Akub, descendants of Hatita, descendants of Shobai, 139 in all. The temple servants, descendants of Ziha, descendants of Hasupha, descendants of Tabaoth, descendants of Keros, descendants of Seiah, descendants of Padon, descendants of Lebanah, descendants of Hagabah, descendants of Akub, descendants of Hagab, descendants of Shammai, descendants of Hanan, descendants of Gidel, descendants of Gehar, descendants of Reahiah, descendants of Rezin, descendants of Nekoda, descendants of Gazam, descendants of Uzzah, descendants of Pasiah, descendants of Besai, descendants of Ashna, descendants of Meunites, descendants of the Nephushites, descendants of Bakbuk, descendants of Hakupha, descendants of Harher, descendants of Basiluth, descendants of Mahida, descendants of Harsha, descendants of Barkos, descendants of Sisera, descendants of Tema, descendants of Neziah, descendants of Hatifa, descendants of Solomon's servants, descendants of Sotai, descendants of Hassophereth, descendants of Peruda, descendants of Jala, descendants of Darkon, descendants of Gidel, descendants of Shephatiah, descendants of Hatil, descendants of Pashereth, Hazabaim, descendants of Amy. A total of the temple servants together with the descendants of Solomon's servants was 392. The following who returned from Tel Milah, Tel Harsha, Cherub, Aden, and Emer were unable to prove that their ancestral houses and their descent were Israelites. Descendants of Delahiah, descendants of Tobiah, descendants of Nekoda, 652. Also of the priest, descendants of Hebaiah, descendants of Hakos, descendants of Barzillai. He had married one of the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and was named after him. These searched their family records, but their names could not be found there, and they were excluded from the priesthood. The governor ordered them not to partake of the most holy foods until there should be a priest to consult the Urim and Thummim. The entire assembly taken together came to 42,360, not counting their male and female servants, who numbered 7,337. They also had 200 male and female singers. Their horses numbered 736, the mules 245, the camels 435, the donkeys 6,770. When they arrived at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, some of the heads of ancestral houses made voluntary offerings for the house of God to rebuild it in its place. According to their means, they contributed to the treasury for the temple service. 61,000 drachmas of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priestly robes. The priests, the Levites, and some of the people took up residence in Jerusalem. The singers, the gatekeepers, the temple servants settled in the cities. Also, the Israelites settled in their cities.